Right, hello there. So, continuing with our pumpkin project for IMVU. So today I'm just going to do a bit more modelling and then we'll take a look at materials, UV mapping and getting all of that sorted out. So, let's just duplicate this so that we have a copy of it to compare to. So, select, object, duplicate, so Shift D. I'll just move this to one side. Hide the avatar, so we're using the outliner again to manage our scene. So hide that. Let's do some editing. So don't want these, I don't know what they're called, these sections. It looks a bit too round, so we're going to, so we can do what we did before. So select vertexes, double tap the G key, so we're edge sliding. Or where's the tool? Which one's the tool? It's that one. Edge slide. So select the vertices. Whoops. Edge slide. Edge slide. Or we can use, it's just going to make it a little easier to see. So we're in solid mode. So what we can also use is what we did yesterday, or in the other video. Where is it? Delete. Dissolve vertices. But if we do it on a shape like this, this can cause the mesh to collapse because Blender can't determine the correct structure that needs to be in place in order for this to work. So what it's done is it's collapsed our object. So we've got an edge from that top vertex to these two, it's not quite the midpoint, but those two vertices, so it's collapsed the entire structure, which we want to avoid obviously. So undo that, Control Z, and let's just use edge slide. So you can use dissolve, but you have to be careful with the results that are produced from it because of the shape of the mesh. And one of the other things as well that I want to watch out for when you use dissolve, let's just do that again. Mesh, delete. It can also sometimes, although that has collapsed the mesh, it'll sometimes mess up the UV mapping that may be in place already. But as we can see from this, it can't quite determine. So there's an edge there, and it's created an edge all the way down there. So that will mean that from a triangle's point of view, it's probably created some very long, triangles to get to those points, because it won't, when it does this sort of structure, it won't be doing this. So it won't be cutting across or generating structure based on these points, so it won't follow the contours. It's trying to join vertex to vertex. So it'll do some odd things. So get rid of that, and we'll just continue using edge slide. So we've now done that, and we've created a duplicate set of vertexes. That won't let us do it, so there's one, there's the other. So we have coincidental vertexes, so what we have to do again is clean up. So select all, and we can see that's manifest because we have very odd mesh smoothing, or the shading. So this dark patch, this generally tells you that there's coincidental vertices at a particular point that's messing up the smooth shading. So select all, mesh, clean up, merge by distance. Let's just increase that to 0.1. So what we've got, or what we end up with, is something that doesn't look quite as balloon-like compared to the previous version. So to continue, so in the other video we left these structures in place. We didn't collapse these vertexes, so we can do that now that we know what we're doing. So select those, M for Marty, collapse those, because we don't actually get that much detail from these vertexes. There's a bit of shaping. And at the bottom, we could probably get rid of this loop. Let's see if we can. Yes, we can. So we can use the edge slide tool and just collapse those into the central vertex. And again, select all, mesh, clean up. So we don't need to use, as we were talking about in the last video, we don't need to use tons of loops to describe the shapes that we're after. If it doesn't do something descriptive visually, just get rid of it, don't use it. Alright, so disable the tool. So at the moment, to disable the tools, we have to activate one of the manipulation widgets. So we can't just click on the tool again to disengage it. So let's take a look at that. That looks all right. So we can do some UV unwrapping. And texture maps. So what we want to do, so we've got two textures ready, and rather than what mentioned in the last video, instead of, because the handlebars are quite large, so this is quite a large structure, relatively speaking, to UV map. So instead of having one texture with the pumpkin at the bottom and a handlebar texture at the top, what we've got now are just two images. So we've got our rough handlebar greenery texture and our rough pumpkin texture. So there's no detail in any of them, in either of them, because we don't know yet at this point how the object is going to be unwrapped. So what we've got is just a very basic generic texture. Because what we're going to do now is unwrap this, and there are a couple of ways we can do this. One of the first things we want to do though is lay out some UV seams. So mark seam. So edge select, and what we want to do is separate the handlebars from the pumpkin. So we select those edges, edge, mark seam. And what we can do for the handlebars, because it's an odd shape, what we want to do is unwrap this so that it's flat. So we need to split it down one side. We're going to use seams for this. Because if we, I don't know, let's go into the UV editor. Yeah, because let's just do a quick, whoops. So that's all Shift Alt or Alt Shift Control. So that's the distorted UV that we've got at the moment. So if we just unwrap it as it currently is, so from the UV menu, unwrap, that's in the 3D view, or UV, where is it? Unwrap in the editor, and it produces this, which is not that much better. It's all messed up. So if we split this along the underside, which means the seam that we generate, so when we mark that, mark seam, it's generally going to be not necessarily hidden from view, but it's going to be more difficult to see because of the way that the object is used in IMVU. So if we're using seams, we want to place them in positions or locations where they are not as obvious. Mark seam. So Shift click, Shift Alt click. So that's the map that we had. So let's unwrap this again. That's what we end up with, which is a bit better, not perfect. Conformal, yeah, that's not any better. So for organic shapes, as soon as you've unwrapped something, you'll get the unwrap properties pop up. And we've got different methods that we can use. Angle-based or conformal. Conformal tends to work better with regular angled shaped objects, whereas angle-based tends to work better for organic shapes, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but But what we could do with these types of objects, in fact, actually, let's make this a little bit easier. What we can do, so because we're going to do a lot of editing, a lot of messing around with the UVs, what we can do, materials, select the handles, and assign a material to this. So click the plus button, click assign, and it'll make the mesh appear blank or white. Populate, click the new button, and we just want to call this handles space square brackets 1 close square brackets. And what this now means is that we can, instead of doing this constant shift click selection, if we want to select the entire segment, what we can do is just select the material, click select, and it highlights everything for us. There's an alternative way of doing this actually, and it's not using materials. What we can do, so let's deselect all of that. What we want, object data properties. So we can go in here, and what we can do is set up a couple of vertex groups. So just click the plus button. Well, in this case we just want to do it twice. Call one pumpkin. Call the other, double click, handlebars. And then what we can do, select our mesh section. So that's everything selected. Select the group that's appropriate for that section and assign it. Double check. So what we can then do is invert that section or selection, so that's Control I or select invert. That's the pumpkin. Select, whoops, assign, then select deselect. So what we can do now is we have two options to selecting a section of the mesh. So we can either use materials, or we can now use vertex groups. So for complex meshes, you can use either or. If you have a number of materials, you can use your materials, but if your object only has one material, so if we were to assign the entire thing, the entire pumpkin bike, to a single texture, what we could do is use vertex groups. So we could create a number of vertex groups depending on how many sections of the mesh we wanted to select as a group without interfering with the materials. So let's get that second material set up. So handles, so shading. So it's just a basic material, so add texture, image texture. Drop that into place, connect, create a new handlebars 256 by 128. Where is it? Color grid. Okay. So now we have an image on the handlebars. So back to the UV editor. In fact, let's just save this before we go any further. So save as 3 So, handles, select. That's the UV map that we've got. Let's double check. So it's not brilliant. So what we can do then is be strategic with our seams. So what we're going to do is cut this, mark a seam. So if we select that, so that's what we've got currently. So if we unwrap this, we end up with that. So what's that section at the bottom there? Right, so we need to get rid of this edge or this seam. So highlight, edge, clear seam. So select the handles again, unwrap. So there we go. That's better. Island. So island, face, edge, vertex. So those are our selection modes. Then we've got the widgets. So this is the global transform, which includes all three elements. So we've got scale, rotate, and move. So that's the widget. If you don't know about the widget, we've got scale. So it scales in the orientation of the corners. We've got lateral scale. So that's the edges. And then we've got rotate, which is a little node that sticks out at the top there. And then we've got move, which is this little X in the center. So the global transform tool has all of these as part of the same tool. So if we click on this node, hold Control down, we're snapping to the increments as we rotate. Move, scale up. So that's going to be on our handlebar texture, which is a bit smaller, but there. So for the pumpkin, so deselect the handlebars, select the pumpkin material, and then click the select button. So this is the default map that we've got for the pumpkin. And this is a leftover or hangover from the default sphere that's dropped into the scene. So if we just add mesh UV sphere, don't have to worry about all of this for the moment. That's the UV map that's assigned to the sphere. If we add, whoops, cube, that's the default map for a cube. So these are all auto-generated when the objects are dropped into the scene. Cylinder, so that's a cylinder. Whoops. Cone, so that's a cone. And you'll note that although these have UV maps, the UV map itself, or the image, isn't appearing on the mesh. That's because they don't have a material assigned to them. But that's the default objects. Each of them has its own map. So for the pumpkin, we could keep the default map. In fact, before we do that, let's duplicate this so we've got a copy of it as reference. Select UV So let's try cylinder projection. Whoops. So we're going to have to scale this X, no it's Y. Scale, so that's the S key, that's the shortcut. So if we use cylinder unwrap, that's what we end up with. And the way that the map is split, so that's the top, which is up here, and it's split the UV relative to the view. So it looks like the seam, or where the mesh has been split to create the UVs, is relative to this, what we're looking at. So let's go into view, viewpoint, front, and do that again. We get a different UV map, or a different layout. Viewpoint, right, sphere. See how it changes? It's also it's subtle, but it changes the way that the UV is split. Viewpoint top. So it's splitting the UV relative to the view. Which can work. It's going a bit mushy. So that's spherical unwrap. What if we do UV cylinder? And I have to scale this again, so that's the S key and the Y axes. Whoops. So that's what we end up with. So that was using the front view. So let's do the right view. And again, we have to scale it. So that's the S key and then Y. And try from the top. So that's what we end up with from the top. wonder what. Let's do smart U. Oh. Yeah, that's that one. Yeah, so to get that looking like that, we have to do it manually. I don't think there's an automated way of creating a UV map that looks like this, as the object would be when it's dropped into a scene in its default state. So what we have to do then is take a look at our object, and we're going to have to lay out some seams to split the UV. So if we just unwrap this as it is and just use a normal unwrap, that's what we end up with. Oof, that's horrible. So what we want to do, because it's a continuous object, it's joined into a single solid shape, so there's no way of Blender being able to determine how this is supposed to be laid out flat, which is what we want. So what we need to do is take a look at our mesh. So we've got these concave sections where I'm not quite sure what these bits are called on a pumpkin, but those indentations, what we can do is use these to hide the seams. I mean, we're not going to do a seam all the way up. Well, we will for one of them, but not all of them. We won't need to do the UV seams all the way up, but, oops, there's a wonky one there. Triangulate, so that's Control T. Control T. There we go. Probably went a bit wonky when we were collapsing. Right, so to get that in particular, these pointy bits at the top, we need to split. Let's move in a little bit. Ordinarily, these are joined like this. And what we want to do is split them so they separate. So again, what we want to do here is use now what's it doing? Edges and marking seams. So we're using the indentation to hide the seams, or at least make them less noticeable. Edge, mark seam. We can do the same on the top. So that's the front of the bike. So that's the back. So what we want to do is lay one down that splits the object completely, because if we don't, let's select that and unwrap. It lays it out flat like that, or flat-ish. But if we don't have that seam, it'll do this. Ooh. You could probably use that, but it'll do that. And how useful that is, or how easy it is to work with, will depend on the shape. But the problem with that is, what we end up with is a very tight distribution of the texture at the top So there's one pixel basically being spread out around this whole area, whereas at the ends we've got dozens of pixels dedicated to these bottom bits, which is why it looks clear at the bottom and blurry at the top. So let's put that seam back in place. Select. Unwrap. So let's do that one. That one's already been done. That one. It's getting there. Alternatively, what we could do so that's just the G key. Move these cardinal vertexes to describe a rectangular-ish shape. So we've got bounds defined by these four corners. What we can do with these, select them, so shift click, is pin them. And they'll highlight red, which means that these are now fixed positions in the UV map. Whoops. So if we unwrap this, the UV map reorientates itself or rejigs itself relative to these fixed points in space. And what we can do is, using these pinned vertices, we can start to get a UV map that looks something like this, but because we've actually got a more detailed shape, so this is just a flat sphere, which makes it easy to unwrap from this point of view. So all these squares are all uniform in shape, whereas our object isn't. It's got all sorts of shapes. So what we can do is use selected vertices, move them into position, pin, do the same at the bottom. So that's just the G key. So we've got G to move, that's a shortcut key, P to pin, P for Peter, and then all the other keys are shortcut keys, R to rotate and S for sugar to scale. And then what we can do as well, a shortcut key, instead of going to the UV map all the time, the shortcut key is U. So what we can do is select these UVs, lay out a rough map like so. So we're selecting the vertices individually. So we can do an Alt right. Well, we don't want to do that on all of them. So I'll do a shift click. Pin them. That's P for Peter. Then unwrap. And we can see how we can relatively quickly get a UV map that's not so much of a mess. And we want to try and keep the area that we define. So this is our corner, and we want to try and move these ones in line with the boundary that we are creating. So just rough position them. That one, that one, and that one, and that one. Unwrap. Then we can just make some minor adjustments. So what we can do actually with these sections is this. So we're lining these vertexes up with these edges, so we're following the edge flow. Doesn't have to be exact. So that's about right. Unwrap. So what we can do now, island, select the whole thing. Rotate. Will it stretch out? Yes, it will. So that is our pumpkin unwrapped. So what we can do to tidy this up, two things, well, one thing really. UV, snap to pixels, corner. What this does is it snaps the individual UVs, so just going to UV select that vertex, and it snaps them to the UV, the pixels of the image itself. So there isn't a grid. Unlike the 3D view, the 2D view doesn't have a grid. So when you are manipulating your UVs, let's just disable that. When you manipulate the UVs, they can slide all over the place. There is a grid that will be that can be snapped to, but for the purposes of low poly modeling, we want to try and keep the vertices, the UV vertices, snapped to the pixels of the image. Because what we want to avoid, so let's zoom right in. What we want to try and avoid, so this is our grid as defined by the pixels of the image. And these points on the grid are whole numbers. So this might be, let's say, 153 vertices along and 109 up. So these are whole numbers. This vertex is 153.8 that way, and let's say 150, well, it's probably 109.8 both ways, so that way. That's what do they call it? I can't think of the word. It's not a whole number. That decimal position means that IMVU might have to optimize that UV or spend extra resources trying to map the position of that UV relative to these corners. So whenever possible, what you want to try and do, UV snap, is snap the vertices to the pixels, because it makes it easier to render the UV maps when all the vertices are pinned or snapped to image pixels. So what we can also do now, if we want to, is straighten up the UVs. Where is that? That's the purple. Blue, green. So there we are. So you just select individual vertexes, press the G key or use the widget and just snap. But that's an extra step. We don't necessarily need to do that, but one thing we do need to do is make sure that the boundary is aligned. So let's top up that one. So 2 down, 2 down, 2 down, 2 down. 2 up, 3 up, 2 up, 1, 2, 3, 3 up. All we want to do here is align, because that's a split in the back of the mesh. What we want to do, as best as we can, is try and avoid these. So we want this area to be like this. And that means for texture artists that when they're painting from one side of the texture to the other, that the whatever they paint flows seamlessly across that edge. So it's 1, 2, 3 down. One, two. So if we watch this side, what it's doing in relation to this area. That's aligned it. So it's still selecting, select all, just do one more unwrap. And that is our pumpkin unwrapped. So we've got the pumpkin and the handlebars. So the handlebars, because they are such wonky shapes, you could, if you wanted to, do the same sort of thing. So we're grabbing individual vertexes, defining the bounds that we want to work within. So that's one corner set. That's another corner set. And this might flip. So if we do unwrap, so don't worry about this one for the moment. So we want this to occupy same sort of space. You don't have to do this, but it makes it easier for derivers to paint. And all we're doing is selecting again, selecting the individual vertices, and we're just moving them relative to their original positions. So we're not readjusting their left-right position, but just their up-down. Or at least not adjusting it too much. Select, pin, unwrap. Do the same at the top. Pin, unwrap. And we can see again how the, oh, which section is that? Oh, that's the end of the handlebars. So that's this side. So pin. And we might have to unwrap. That's okay. Pin, unwrap. So that's one side done. Let's do the other side. R for rotate, snap to the grid. So that includes the bottom. So let's make that a little bit bigger. Right, so pin these four. That's our outer extreme. Pin those two, unwrap, and then just do the same thing again. Now, of course, this does mean that because we are, doing what we're doing to the UV map, it means that certain areas will have increased texture density compared to other areas, but it makes it easy to derive from. Move those two, snap, unwrap, and we can see how we're now getting two regular shaped UV sections. Pin, unwrap. So that's the bottom. Scale that up. It's a little bit bigger. So that's both sides of the handlebars done. So you can do that as well. Let's make them roughly the same size. So that's the handlebars. So you can do either or. You can leave it in its organic form, which is, did we? Yeah, so you can leave it like that. Or you can square it up or formalize it into something like that. So let's just save this. So back to layout, save as number 4. So that view frame selected, so we're rotating around our object. So that is our pumpkin given a material or materials and unwrapped. So what we can do with this now, so those are our materials. What we can do now, shading, now how did we do this? So don't like the way Blender does this. So we're going to replace these generated images that we've got. So we select our material, click on the file icon, browse to our image, which is pumpkin. So that's our pumpkin texture. It just replaces the generated image that we had. Click on handles, do the same thing again. Click on the file icon. Scroll down to, and there is our replacement textures. Let's just get rid of the specular. So the pumpkins aren't quite as shiny. So that's our replacement. So we've now replaced those. That doesn't look too bad actually. So we've now replaced our generated images with some basic painted textures. So what we can do now is create our texture maps. So again, using our materials, UV edit mode, double check, select the material, select. So we've got our UV selected in the editor. UV, export UV layout, and we want pumpkin handlebars brackets UV. We can increase the size, even though we've used a 128 by 256, we can actually increase the size of the map that's generated, because it's basically just a wireframe version. Well, it converts the wireframe that we've got into an image. So we can increase the size of it if we want to. Format, generally going to be PNG, and the fill opacity, if we want just a wireframe, we set that to 0, and that'll just produce a wireframe with no faces or no. So we've got this tinted orange color in the UV editor. These areas will be blank or transparent, fully transparent. So what we can do is 0 for full transparency or 1 for full opacity. So these will be filled, as the name implies. Then just click Export UV Layout. Let's open that in. So that was the handlebars. That's affinity. So where are the UVs? Pumpkin. Oh, there it is. Oh, it's tiny. But that's the UV map. So we can see that the faces are filled with a colour or a tint, and then we've got the wireframe. So that's our texture map. Let's do the one for the pumpkin, because that's the right size. So deselect, select material, select button. So that's our UV map. UV, export UV layout. So we want pump in UV. Same settings. Oh, in fact, actually cancel. Let's double check. Make sure that we are using pumpkin. .256 by 512 PNG 1 export. So let's take a look at that. And center and middle, and that is our UV map. So if you wanted to, you could paint on this. Well, that's what this is for, painting. So we know, because of the way that we did this, we know that this is the back of the mesh. So this must be the front. So if you wanted to, you could paint your pumpkin face on the front of the pumpkin bike. So instead of having that cut out, actually physically cut out of the mesh, just paint it on the texture. So let's just replace the materials. Oops, deselect, select. Double check the shading materials. That's all right. So yeah, that's it. That's our object UV mapped. So in the next video, what we'll do this isn't a bug, but what would be nice is, depending on the material that's selected, it used to do this, but it, because of the way that Blender builds its materials up and the data blocks that are used for doing that, everything is independent and it's all linked together. And the way that that works means that if you select a material and then select the face that's associated with that material, you don't always get the actual image that's associated with that, that's been mapped to the object, showing up in the UV editor. So you have to double check that the materials and the textures are properly linked. So if you select an element of your mesh and the texture doesn't change, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with your material. So if that happens, just double check, because it'll do it. So let's just move that all the way over here to make it easier to see. So it'll do it in the shading editor. because that is loading in the nodes that are specifically associated with the material that's assigned to that particular section of the mesh. And obviously that means you can double check image assignments, and if it's listed here, that means the material is set up correctly. So despite what doesn't happen in UV editing, well, that's despite what doesn't happen in UV editing, but that is our object unwrapped and ready for the next phase, which is adding our custom seat node and pose. So we'll do that in the next video. So once again, thanks for lurking, lurkers. And if you have any questions, just pop them in under the video or wherever the video appears. And don't forget to subscribe, click the buttons and do all the things. Oh, hang on, we haven't saved the file yet. So let's just save that. File, save as 5. So the few objects in the scene. So that's what we had originally from yesterday, or last video. And this is what we've now got. Not bad. Right, so pose is next, so we'll do that in the next video. So thanks for watching, lurkers, and we shall see you anon. So bye for now.